from 1993 to 2007. The research showed that just the addition of one robot cut the jobs of 6 workers. Keep that in mind. Also keep in mind, this study covers a time frame that in the tech world is now considered ancient history. This was over 11 years ago. During that time, 670,000 jobs were lost to automation. And not only these jobs were lost, but new jobs were not created for the workers that were now left unemployed. Extrapolating that study and those folks at MIT, I mean, they're pretty smart people, we're looking now at a loss of over 3 million jobs, all of them erased by robots and automation by the year 2020. That's just 2 years from now. And those figures are very conservative. If you think that's troubling, consider that Foxconn in China, the slave labor factories that mass produce all of our cell phones, they just recently announced that they're laying off over 10,000 workers. Why? Automation. It's gotten to the point where China is now replacing slaves with robots. When that happens, do you think we're ever going to be able to replace those jobs here? These are also just manufacturing jobs. It doesn't calculate the effects of artificial intelligence. It doesn't include other industries that are also already going heavily automated. Have you been to a fast food joint lately? Right now, you can, at many of them, bypass the human and order from a touch screen. Did you go Christmas shopping? Did you actually shop in a real store? Companies like Amazon are taking over the market. Transportation, Uber. Cars are going to go driverless. How many Uber drivers will lose their job? How many taxi cab drivers, truckers, limo drivers? How many will be looking for work? How many car dealerships will go out of business? Conservative estimates show over 5 million lost jobs in the auto industry alone in the near future.
For example, because I think even a lot of really good people are profoundly misunderstanding what's happening with the opioid crisis. Where is the opioid crisis happening? Right, I've been to a lot of the epicenters of it, places like Monadnock in New Hampshire. Why are things so disastrous there? Why is there much higher opioid addiction in West Virginia than on the faculty of Harvard, right? People on the faculty of Harvard have much better access to opioids, right? Everyone there has good health insurance. They have much better access. What's going on? Some amazing economists, Sir Angus Dayton and Anne Case, did a massive study of this, and they said that we need to understand the opioid deaths mainly as what they call deaths of despair, right? It's not a coincidence that the places where opioid addiction is highest are also the places where suicide, not with opioids, is highest, where antidepressant prescriptions are highest. These things are clustering together for a reason, right? And you don't have to spend much time in those places to see people through no fault of their own are like the rats in that first cage, right? They have been deprived of the things that make life meaningful. This doesn't mean chemical hooks don't play some role. They do play a role. But I've been to the places that have solved this, and it wasn't by thinking primarily about that. So I'll just talk about the reality of chemical hooks, if that's all right, because I think it's very important to understand in relation to opioids. So there's a very strong agreement among scientists that the most powerful chemical hook we know is nicotine, right? You smoke cigarettes, like my mother smokes 70 cigarettes a day. You smoke cigarettes. The thing you feel a physical craving for when you stop, which my mother would never do, is nicotine, right? That's the chemical hook. And so in the late 80s, when nicotine patches were invented, there's this huge wave of optimism among scientists because they're like, oh, right, cigarette smoking is an addiction to the chemical hook, nicotine. Now we can give people all the chemical hook they're addicted to without any of this shitty cancer-causing smoke. People are going to stop smoking, right? So nicotine patches are introduced, and the US Surgeon General's report a couple of years later finds highly motivated people using nicotine patches, 17% of them will stop smoking, right? Now, it's important to say that is not nothing, right? That means if you meet the chemical hook for people who are addicted to cigarettes, 17% of them will stop entirely. That's a big deal, right? That saved a huge number of people's lives. But obviously, 17% is not 100%. That leaves 83%. They've got to be explained by the other things. And that's really the factors that I talk about in Lost Connections. So, I mean, there's a whole range of them, but, you know, if you are acutely lonely, we are the loneliest society there's ever been, right? You are much more likely to be vulnerable to despair, depression, addiction. If you are controlled and humiliated at work, which most people now are to some degree, you're much more vulnerable to these things. There's a whole range. I go through 9 of these factors in the book, but to me, the most important thing in thinking about the opioid crisis, and I find it really frustrating that this is never discussed in the American debate, is I've been to the place that solved an opioid crisis, that had a disastrous opioid crisis and ended it, right? And they did something that's very different to what Americans are being urged to do. So I'm a Swiss citizen because my dad's from there, so I know Switzerland well. And by the time you get to the year 2000, Switzerland is having like an opioid nightmare, right? To get rid of it. And 70% of Swiss people voted to keep heroin legal, not because they're so compassionate, to be honest. They're not. They're really not. It was because crime fell so much, right? It's much cheaper to
How much did crime fall?
I've got the statistics in the book. It's a few years since I wrote it, but there was, I think, something like a 50% fall in street crime. Street prostitution literally ended, right? There was no street prostitution after that. Turns out women, you know, don't want to be on the street being fucked by random strangers for money if they've got like an alternative. Who knew? But so there was an enormous fall in crime across the board, and the police confirmed that. Everyone agrees with that in Switzerland. And all the kind of anarchy in the streets just stopped, right? But the reason I think this is really relevant to the opioid crisis is what we're doing is the exact opposite, right? So they give them the safe version of the drug, give them help to figure out why, practical support to change their environment, to get out of that isolated cage and more into a life that's more like Rat Park. What do? If your doctor in this country finds out that you are using, say, Percocet or Oxy, not because you've got back pain, but because you've got an addiction, your doctor, by law, has to cut you off, right? If they don't, they can be busted as a dealer. It's happened to lots of doctors. So they have to cut you off. So instead of giving you the drug, we stop you getting the drug. Most people then, or not most, a very large number, then transfer to much more dangerous street drugs like heroin. Secondly, far from giving you help to turn your life around, we give you a criminal record. We shame you, we stigmatize you, we put barriers between you and reconnecting. The opposite of addiction is connection, but what do? We put barriers between people and reconnecting. This is why, that's one part of it, right? So there's the drug policy part of it, where we're doing exactly the opposite of the country that succeeded in ending its opioid epidemic. But there's something I think that's even deeper than that, which you really see in places like West Virginia, Monadnock, the kind of hearts of the opioid crisis, which is we're also creating a society that is becoming harder and harder for people to be present.
The American people is that technology is the oil of the 21st century, and what they're doing for Alaskans, we can do for all Americans.
What is the oil of the 21st century?
The only thing I worry about is that some total unknown that nobody ever heard of comes along.
And what is the oil of the 21st century? And what is the oil of the 21st century? And what is the oil of the 21st century? And what is the oil of the 21st century?
The only thing I worry about is that some total unknown that nobody ever heard of comes along.
And what is the oil of the 21st century?